So anyway, so I'm Maggie McCoy, and I am the Education and Volunteer Coordinator for EarthWays Center at the Missouri Botanical Garden. So typically most people or most volunteers interact with me when they're helping us sort waste at our waste stations during really large events. So a lot of this training is pulled from there, but also from some other classes. So this class is not specifically about how to be a zero waste ambassador at the garden, but it's sort of a deep dive into sort of the back end stuff of how it works. So if you ever do become an ambassador, you'll have a really good idea of what happens to our waste here in St. Louis and why we do all the things the way we do them. So it's kind of why we did this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and pop up my screen so that I can share it with you all. Okay. And you might notice sometimes that there's a little lag in between when I say something's up and when it comes up and gives it a minute to load. But hopefully everything should work fine. Andrea and I tested it earlier, so hopefully it'll look okay. So if you're not familiar with the EarthWays Center, we are a division of the Missouri Botanical Garden, and we're the sustainability division. So there's a staff of about 11 or 12 of us now that work mainly on sustainability issues that are out in the community, but a few of us work also on some things internally at the garden. So a lot of us connect with businesses, local communities, individuals and families, homeowners, schools, students and educators, universities and college, and then also staff at the garden, all working towards trying to help people make and practice sustainable solutions. So that's a lot of the work that we do. We're located in the Commerce Bank building. If you haven't been down there before, but that's where we normally are. So very rarely are we on the main campus. So if you don't see us all that often, that's why. But we're at all of our major events helping to sort waste. We do have an internal sort of green resources answer service. So you're familiar with the plant doctor. At EarthWays, we have the planet doctor, and that's Jean Ponzi. So if you ever have any questions after this presentation that you really don't know, you can contact that green resources answer service with any sustainability question, and she should be able to help you guys figure that out. So it's a great resource. Since we are talking about sustainability, one of the things I wanted to get from you guys was just see kind of in the chat feature what you guys thought sustainability meant. So if you guys could just take a minute and write in the chat kind of what you think sustainability means. It's kind of a big question, so it's a good time to just take a minute to think about it before we dive into this. Okay, so I see reusing when possible, using as little natural resources possible, reduce, reuse, recycle, being responsible for our earth, animals and people, leave only footprints, take only pictures. I like that one. Only using what's necessary. Not wasting things. 3 R's. Yeah. So these are all pretty typical things that we see when we're talking about what sustainability is. What I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about right at the beginning is kind of how we think of sustainability at EarthWays and kind of how we talked with people about it, which should help sort of give an idea of how we talk about it at the garden and what we're thinking about. So I kind of cut off my stuff there, but one of the things that we talk about a lot with sustainability is either this triple bottom line or the three-legged stool model. I realize it just says three-legged, stool must be somewhere off to the side. But we look at sort of how three pieces come together, which is looking at economic impact, environmental impact, and social impact. So when we look at kind of what our decision's going to be, how are we going to choose to do things moving forward on any topic, we look at how our choices affect sort of those three spheres. And if we can do well in all three of those areas, then that's kind of what we consider to be sustainability. So you can get two of them, but that's not necessarily sustainability. It might be social justice, or it might be really good for business, but we want to make sure that we hit all three of those things. The one I really like with students, because I work a lot with students, that I think works really well, is this one at the bottom, which is from the UN Brundtland Report in 1987, but which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So when I talk with students about this, a lot of times we talk about, if we're talking about trash, recycling, or compost, we talk about is the stuff that we're doing with our trash today, could we imagine that we would still be doing that in 100 years? And if our answer is no, then it's probably not something that we think is going to be sustainable, and maybe we need to make some tweaks. So that's kind of how we think of it is, would it be responsible for us to be doing this in 100 years? Maybe not. Then we need to make some changes. And it's always a process. So we talk a lot about how sustainability is this continuum. You're going to have people on one side who don't really do anything or have any mind towards being sustainable. You have people on the other side who are, they're sustainable in sort of every aspect of their life, 110%. And most of us fall somewhere in the middle. And so sort of our goal at EarthWays is to help people sort of move another step along the continuum and keep making small changes, because that tends to work really well. So that's kind of how we think of sustainability. One of the things that we're using a lot at the garden now when we're talking about sustainability, and some of you may be familiar with this, is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So these were goals that came out in 2015 from the United Nations. They replaced what they called the Millennium Development Goals, which came out in 2000. And the goal of the Millennium Development Goals was to sort of eliminate extreme poverty. That was really the whole reason why they developed those. But after 15 years, which was sort of the length of time that they were going to use those, they realized that a lot of those focused on what we would think of as the developing world, or you might call them third world countries. And there wasn't a lot aimed at countries that already had a lot of technology and developed and infrastructure. So these development goals were aimed at sort of all countries in the world and sort of what we could do to become more sustainable. So these are our 17 goals, which is a lot to take in. But it's interesting to kind of look at these and see how these all come together to form a more sustainable picture. So it's not just these, I think, traditional pieces of sustainability like climate action. For us at the garden, our life on land, our plants, or our life below water, but it also includes not having poverty as part of sustainability. Making sure that everyone gets a quality education is part of that. Gender equality is another piece of that. Making sure that we have decent work and economic growth. All those things go into us developing sustainably. So that's another way that we are starting to look at sustainability at the garden and sort of how we're thinking about what we're doing. And there's a lot you can do. And sometimes it's really overwhelming to look at all these things. And we can hear a lot of bad news about sustainability, or maybe some good news sometimes, and we're just not really sure what action to take. So today we're just going to focus on these waste actions and kind of what we can do about the waste that we actually produce in our own homes and at work. So you may have seen these lovely tents if you've been to an event at the garden, like Japanese Festival, Best of Missouri, Chinese Culture Days, but these are our zero waste tents. And this is our big effort at the garden to try and cut down on our waste from large events. So right now, through our process of sending things to either recycling or composting, we divert about 90% to 95% of waste at major events from the landfill. So we recycle and compost the majority of it, which is really great. So sort of if you want to know where your stuff goes, and why we think this is such a big issue, one of the things that we really look at is that in the US, we have this problem. We make, use, and throw away a lot of stuff. On average, a person in the US produces about 4.5 pounds of waste per day. And that sort of wraps up things you send to recycling to. So it includes all that in its number, but it's about 4.5 pounds. And that really adds up when you think about the US as a whole. In 2017, Americans generated about 268 million tons of trash. Anyone, if you want to type into the chat function, anyone have a guess as maybe a percentage, how much of that you think was recycled or composted? Let's see. And I hope you all are not as cynical as I was, because I lowballed it pretty hard the first time I took a guess. Okay, so I'm seeing 25, 11, 35, 45. Okay, we've got some optimists in the group. I like this. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to think about it. So let me see if I can get this back. About 97 million of that was recycled or compost. So it typically comes in at about a third. So whoever was close to 35%, you're right about on track. So it sounds pretty high, and it's a decent number. It's much higher than I thought it was, but that's sort of overall our average. So some places obviously do better with this than others. Thinking about where we are in St. Louis, between like the city and county, we recycle anywhere from 10 to 20%. We don't have any sort of formal composting program for residents. So that's not necessarily part of it like it is in other parts of the country. So we have some room to grow, but average across the country, we're not doing too badly. And there's just a lot of stuff that actually, goes into those numbers across the country, and Missouri tends to be pretty typical. So they do this study about every 10 years in Missouri where they kind of look at what goes into our landfill. So they refer to it as municipal solid waste, or MSW. So if you ever see that phrase, that just means the trash, regular trash from our homes and businesses that goes to the landfill. It's not construction waste or special waste or anything like that. It's what you and I are throwing away every day. So about a third of that is actually organics, which includes food waste, other types of things that could be composted or mulched. So 15% of everything that goes into our landfill is actually food waste. So that's about 1 out of every 6 things that is in our landfill is going to be food. So it's a pretty high number, but again, it's not completely unusual across the US. Paper and cardboard comes in at about 25%, which was surprising to me because I feel like that was the thing that I learned first to recycle. But paper and cardboard, plastics is about 15% of what's in our landfill. Inorganics, which is just other categories that can't necessarily be composted. Metals comes in at about 4.5%. The big reason for that is that metals are incredibly valuable to recycle. You can make a lot of money recycling metals, so very few people are ever going to put them into our landfill. And then about 1.5% is what we call special waste, or e-waste, or electronics waste. While this is a really, really small percentage of what goes into our landfill, it tends to be what's responsible for about 70% of the really messy toxins in our landfills. So we'll touch on it at the end, but if you can properly dispose of your chemicals at home and your electronics waste, that goes a really long way to making sure that nothing bad gets into our landfills. Now, in that same paper that I read through, talking about all those different categories, I came across this, which I thought was really interesting when we're talking about what can be recycled and composted. This has like the driest title imaginable, which is the divertibility of dispose, MSW. I like to think of it as the what else could have been done with it graph, which basically tells us out of the stuff that went into the landfill, could it have gone anywhere else? So about a quarter of the stuff that goes into our landfills could go into curbside recycling, which is that regular old blue bin, the things that we traditionally think of recyclable that you just have to put out into your dumpster or your roll cart. About a quarter of what's in our landfills, that type of material. So stuff that we could really easily divert. Another 15% over here is what we call non-curbside recyclables. So those are items that can be recycled, but you just have to do a little extra work. So things like electronics that you have to take to a drive, your plastic bags that you have to take back to the store, some of those other specialty items that have programs out there, but not curbside. About a quarter of it, again, could be composted or mulched. So we could use it in some other way. So that tends to be that organic waste. And then another 35% of it, we don't really have another place to go with it right now. The landfill's kind of the best we have if we're going to be using that material. So a lot of times we talk with students about our landfills part of sustainability. And while we'd like to imagine, you know, in a couple hundred years that we're not having to trash stuff anymore, right now the reality is that we do have a lot of material that we just don't have anything else to do with, and we'd much rather have it end up in a landfill than say in our oceans and in our environment. So if you have to throw something away, don't lose sleep over it. It's okay. Some of our stuff will end up in the landfill, and that's a good spot to keep it because landfills are really good at containing material. So this kind of just shows the flow of how things go. We dump stuff, you know, out in our dumpsters. If it's going away to a landfill, it goes to a garbage truck. Typically, it'll go to what we call a transfer station, which is a really big area where the garbage trucks that are small, that come by our homes, will dump all their waste, and then they'll go into these really, really big trucks because these companies are really good at using as little fuel as possible. And it's not wrong. They market it as sustainability, and it certainly is more sustainable to use less fuel, but they really watch their bottom line pretty well. So they're pretty good at figuring out how to get material to one place, load it onto something bigger, and then drive it somewhere else. Here in Missouri, most of the time it's just gonna go straight to the landfill if it's trash. If it's recycling, it'll go to what we call a material recovery facility. And then it will get sent out to manufacturers. Also with a place like St. Louis Composting, it'll go to a composting facility, and we'll kind of see what that looks like. So our landfill, what is life at the landfill like? So these are some pictures of landfill. So you can see here, this is that really big tipper truck we were talking about. It looks like a semi, but it has like a special place where a lever can go in so it can tip it all out into the landfill. So sort of some features of the landfill. What the job of the landfill is to contain trash. It's not like a really big compost pile where everything is going to decompose. They're trying to put as much trash in as they can, squish it down, and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So they have a really big truck called a compactor that drives over and compresses the trash daily, so they can squeeze out as much air as possible. They put a couple inches of dirt on every night to try and make sure that they reduce those pests and those odors that could be attracted to the landfill, and also to keep stuff from blowing away. And we'll have a little graphic in a minute, but it's constructed and engineered in these cells and layers to make sure that nothing is getting out of it. And there's a lot of systems in landfills that are built in to try and keep pollution from exiting them. So these are sort of our layers of the landfill. So sort of the big thing that we worry about at landfills a lot of the time is leachate. So the best way I like to describe leachate is if you think of water that runs through the entire landfill and everything it picks up, when it gets to the bottom, that's leachate. Sometimes if you need another visual, like the water at the bottom of your dumpster, if it rains, that water that sort of collects at the bottom that you can sort of smell when you open the dumpster is sort of like a miniature, very mild form of leachate. So it's stuff we do not want in our water. So our groundwater down here is what we're trying to protect. So landfills will put a really thick layer of clay that water has a very hard time passing through. And then they'll put sort of like this thick plastic layer down here. It's a few millimeters thick, but it's pretty hard to puncture. And that sort of keeps all the water from going out into any groundwater that might be nearby and sort of poisoning our water supply. They often put what we call a textile mat on top of that, just so nothing sort of gets through and punctures that layer. It sort of protects that layer from getting holes in it. There's a pipe that sort of runs through that layer to collect that leachate or that water that's coming through, so it can go to a water treatment facility and be cleaned before it goes back out to the river. And we've got gravel and sand on top of all of that just to make sure no big chunks of trash sort of fall down and get into that pipe. And then each day we have layers of trash, then dirt, then trash, then dirt, then trash, then dirt, until your landfill is full. So they put in a lot of protections to make sure that the water's safe. Many of them will have test sites around the landfill to make sure they test regularly to make sure there's no chemicals leaching out. They're very regulated facilities. The other thing that we sort of get concerned with at landfills is a gas called methane. So methane is a really, really potent greenhouse gas, and it's created basically when things are decomposing without oxygen. So in the landfill, they squish all the air out, so everything in the landfill is decomposing without oxygen. So we create a lot of this methane, and it does about, you know, depending on how you look at it, it is about 28 to 32 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of its ability to heat the planet. So it's one of those that we really don't want in the atmosphere. It's a pretty bad pollutant. So all landfills have to manage their methane. That's required of them. But what our landfill does and we'll show you in a minute what our landfill's like, they have these gas wells that sort of look like this, that collect the landfill gas. Our landfill's got about 220, 225 of them now. And it actually, we send it off to a plant from Ameren where they use it to create electricity. Not all landfills have that. We're pretty lucky to have that, so we're using that gas in a useful way. But every landfill has to collect it and properly dispose of it in some way. So that's the other sort of big concern that we have. And then when you're done filling it, they put down this nice layer of plastic on top just to make sure that nothing else is going to sort of leach into the landfill. So lots of protections. So the landfill here, and we're actually going to go on a little tour of it in a second. This landfill here is the Champ landfill. So this is the one that if you live in St. Louis County, your waste most likely goes to. Most of our trash from St. Louis City goes over to Roxana, Illinois. If you live in St. Louis County, your trash likely comes to the Champ landfill. So we're gonna, you know, hopefully I'm not getting too fancy here, but I tried to do a Google Earth tour of the area, so I'm gonna try and switch to that now. Move this out of the way. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the Google Earth right now. Andrea, can you see that okay? Okay, perfect. And I'm gonna move this bar out of the way so it's not in the way. Perfect. So we're gonna kind of go through a look to sort of orient you to where it is. Route 141 is over here. It's not Riverport anymore. Hollywood Casino Amphitheater is right over here. The Missouri River and St. Charles are over here, 70 and 270. So it's sort of right in the middle of all of this. So it's kind of a really cool place. We've been lucky enough to do a field trip there before. But if you're imagining your trash truck and you're going in, you're gonna come in off 141, and the first thing you get to do when you get to the landfill is you get to weigh your truck. And the reason they weigh the truck when you come into the landfill on these scales is they want to know how much you're bringing in, and then they weigh you when you go out, and that's how we get charged for basically our trash, is through those fees that get collected at the landfill, because the landfill obviously wants to get paid to do all this work, and those get passed on to us through all those landfill fees that we pay to get our trash taken away. So they get weighed, they go through the scale, and then they basically go to the part of the landfill for the day where they will be filling. So they try and break it down into places that they're filling each day, so the trucks only have to go to one place. But as they add trash and they cover it up, they have to switch where they're dumping. So the roads at the landfill are always moving. It's kind of a new experience every time we go because they're always putting trash somewhere different. So a lot of times, like the tipper trucks like these will back up. They have these little sort of really big stacks of tires so that as the trucks are reversing, they're sort of like, if you can imagine, like giant cones so that people in really large trucks know where to reverse to, make sure that everyone's got a lane, they dump out their trash. and they leave again. And then this is our little compactor that's going over all the trash. So basically that's how they fill it every day. Our landfill has a couple extra special features though. Our Champ landfill is actually in an active quarry right now. So one part of it's actually full and they're not putting trash in it. One part they're still putting trash in, and one part they're actually actively still mining from each day. So this is sort of the active quarry portion. And it's really hard to imagine the scale of it unless you're there, but I'm trying to help envision it as we're going through this tour. This wall that you see sort of in front of you here is about 220 feet deep. So if you can imagine, a 22-story building could be dropped right into the deepest part of the landfill since they're quarrying things out. So as they're adding trash each day, that's sort of the space that they have to work with, is this just absolutely massive area. To sort of give you an idea of the scale, like this is a bulldozer. I mean, like the place is just huge. So they actively quarry each day, and they take the stone over to a place where it gets processed. They used to, I think, do their sort of set their charges and explosions at like 3:30 each day, because they always waited till the school that's right next door got out, so they weren't making a big noise in the middle of the day. So they normally set it, they clear out all the stone, and then they do it again the next day. So they're constantly clearing out new space in the quarry, and then the trash will move over there. In our landfill, we also have a yard waste compost site. So some of your yard waste might actually be going to this landfill to get composted. So they have these really big rows where they're composting yard waste as well in one part of the landfill. So they're kind of using all these different spaces for a lot of different features. And we're going to fly over now to sort of the south part of the landfill. So this south part is actually the part that's already full. So they stopped putting trash here in about 2012, and that's when they moved over to that sort of that north portion of the landfill. But you can kind of see they got tarps in some places, but typically most landfills can fill up to about 40 feet above sort of normal ground level. So that was about how tall that hill is there, is about 40 feet tall. But that's sort of the spot that they're not dumping anymore. And it's actually right next to where the Ameren power plant is. So you can kind of see over here is Pattonville High School. So when we talk about keeping pollution inside landfills, that's one of those things we want to think about, is that they're right next to where people go to school. There's tons of neighborhoods over here. So we want to keep them safe. This Ameren power plant, they send that landfill gas, which is a mix of carbon dioxide and methane, over to this power plant. And it creates electricity for thousands of homes every day. I want to say it's between like 11 to 13,000 when they're at full capacity, but they create quite a bit of electricity just from landfill gas at that power plant. So it's a pretty neat way to use a waste product. And then right next door to that is our entire limestone processing area, where they're processing all this limestone they're quarrying into different sizes to use for different purposes. A lot of it's going into road construction, but that sort of whole operation is also within the landfill's footprint. So to kind of give you a final overview, they have a little lookout spot above the landfill that we always get to go to when we're going on a tour. But if you're sort of looking this way, you can see our Ameren plant, our quarry area, the south part of the landfill. We can rotate over and see the open cell and kind of where they're filling and how it slopes down into the quarry. And then sort of pan over and you can see sort of the yard waste area, and then sort of the place where they're actively digging out rock. So that's kind of our whole landfill operation and what happens to your trash when it actually leaves you. So it's a pretty interesting thing. Anyone have any questions about the landfill? Okay, where do the landfills get the dirt soil to repeatedly cover layers of trash? That's a really good question. I'd have to ask where they get the soil from. I know often they do sort of scrape it off so they can start over again, just so they're not using those inches. So I do know quite a bit of it is reused every day, but I'd have to check to see where they actually get the soil. Are trucks designated for bulky big pickup the same as regular trash pickup, or are there additional steps? I would have to check on that one as well. I'm not 100% sure. I know like construction waste goes to a different landfill entirely. So I don't know if there's another landfill entirely for that kind of stuff. I've seen pretty bulky items at this landfill before, but I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, and then our landfill has this other extra little step. Since they are in a quarry, they have to pump out water every day. So most landfills are above the water table, like we talked about. So they have to protect it with those layers. They still have the protection in this landfill, but they're actually below the water table. So water actually floods into the landfill every day. So you can kind of see, let me shrink this again. There's sort of water gathered at the bottom. So they actually have to pump water out every day to make sure that their landfill is not flooding. So it's this extra little step that they have to take. Okay, I think I got all the ones that came in. Oh, let me see, maybe there's one more. How close is this landfill to the Westlake landfill? I don't know in terms of miles. This one again is right at where 141, 70 and 270 come together. So it's in Maryland Heights. I think from the highest point, like that lookout point, on a really clear day, you could probably see the Westlake landfill, but it's a decent amount of miles from here. And then, yeah, so the Westlake landfill is the one where they dumped a whole bunch of radioactive material, and that's where you hear about that fire being underground. I think the fire underground is actually another landfill that's right next door to it, but they don't want it to like move over there. I'm not an expert on that landfill, but this one does not have any underground fires, so no worries there. Okay, so we get to move on and talk about recycling now, which is sort of, I think, what I tend to hear from everybody kind of about what they want to talk about is recycling. So just some terms to go over before we move into recycling. You'll hear me use the word single stream, which is the system that we have in most of St. Louis City and County. So that's that all-in-one bin system that takes your paper, your cardboard, your plastics, your aluminum, so your metals, those types of things, all of it goes in. That's called single stream. If we have anybody who's from St. Charles or some other places around St. Louis, some of you may have what's called dual stream, where they separate paper and cardboard into one stream and all containers into the other. So depending on where you live, it might be a little bit different. Contaminant, that's anything that's in the recycling bin that we didn't want there. Oftentimes it's plastic bags, but it could be things like food, just anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Hauler is the company that actually comes to take your recycling or trash away from your home or business. So oftentimes your hauler is one person, Waste Connections, Waste Management, Republic, and the place where your trash or recycling is going is a different company altogether. So it's just important to make sure that you know which one is which in your area and who your hauler is. Sometimes you'll hear us use the word MRF or term MRF, which is the material recovery facility, and we just sort of abbreviate it. A lot of times this is what people call the recycling center, but this is where machines sort of sort through all the different single stream items to make sure that they get separated out and can get sold. Markets is just reflecting how things get sold, and then we just talked about the landfill. So what happens to your recyclables? Most of your recycling, if you're in St. Louis City or County, goes to the Republic MRF in Hazelwood. That one says over 300 tons per day. I think the last time I was there, their plant manager said they were doing about 500 tons a day. So the number fluctuates. They go through a lot of material every day. And this is the stuff that you should put in your recycling. And only these items. If you're putting it in your blue bin, it should only be these 6 things. If you use single stream. So paper, flattened cardboard, any plastic bottles and containers, feel free to leave the lids on, glass bottles and jars, metal food and beverage cans, and then food and beverage cartons. Sometimes they're called like a Tetra Pak or aseptic packaging, but those can be recycled at our MRF in Hazelwood. So the biggest thing is just to make sure that things are loose, so not in any plastic bags, that they're empty, clean, and dry. You don't have to take a paper towel and dry it out, you know, just shake it upside down, make sure there's no more liquid dumping out of it, and that's fine. You know, if it's peanut butter jar, scrape out that peanut butter, give it to your dog, they'll take care of it. You know, but we just want it mainly empty, mainly clean, mainly dry. I see a question already. This is normally where things go off the rails. Oh, it's Andrea, good job. Has anyone toured the MRF? It is a pretty cool place, and I have a video of it today, but I also have pictures. I know Andrea also shared with you the virtual tour that their plant manager, Brent, did. It is phenomenal. Anytime you can hear Brent talk about recycling, it is such a gift. He's so good at talking about it, and especially the market side of it. So if you get a chance to watch that, it's way better than what I'm about to do, but this is the really short version of it. So let's see. So things that cannot go into your single stream recycling. No styrofoam, no number 6, not ever, don't put it in there. A lot of it can be what's called, I guess, like self-contaminating material, but basically if you put food in it, sauce kind of gets into all those holes. It's a really big mess. They can't separate it out. There's not really a good market for number 6, at least the type of stuff that we produce at our homes. There are some industrial facilities like furniture places that actually have like the styrofoam that furniture comes packaged in. They actually have like a vacuum that sucks all the air and makes these giant styrofoam bricks, which is pretty interesting. But most of the time for like food styrofoam, you just can't recycle it. Things like utensils and other really small items can't be processed. As you'll see in a minute, it's an industrial facility. Pretty much anything that's smaller than the circle in the OK symbol of your hand is never going to make it through. It's just going to fall off the belt. It's just going to get lost. So nothing too small. None of these envelopes that have plastic on the inside or bubble wrap, because that's too many materials mixed together. Please, no plastic bags, and I'll show you why in a second. But please, if you remember nothing else, do not put your plastic bags in single stream recycling. No food, no binders, none of these sort of like shiny chip bags. They're great materials, but they all have to go be reused somewhere else, go into compost if it's food, or just go to the landfill. They don't belong at a single stream recovery facility. So the first thing that happens is we have this tipping floor where all of this stuff goes. It goes into a drum feeder, so it evenly spreads out kind of what goes on the line so they can deal with it in a good amount of time. It goes through a pre-sort station where there's people who are actually in there pulling stuff on the line, off the line, that's obviously not recyclable. So if you've ever put anything in your recycling recently, if it's in a plastic bag like this, that gets pulled off and goes to the landfill because they don't know what's in it. They can't spend time all day slicing these open. So anything in a trash bag like this comes right off. If they can pull off any plastic bags, they do that. Any really big items, anything larger than a 5-gallon bucket's gonna get pulled off. They were telling us the other day that they had like some Olympic weight like shot puts that came through that they had to pull off the line, because if those had gone into the facility, they would have just torn the place apart. So this is the spot where they're looking for the things that can really do damage, are really obviously not recyclable, and they're gonna pull them out there. Then it goes through these cardboard screens and glass crushers. So basically it's like these really big spinning discs. So anything that's flat, like paper and cardboard, is gonna get pulled along. And anything that has a 3D shape is gonna fall through. So the glass is gonna fall through and shatter, and they'll be able to collect that and send that off for recycling. And the cardboard and fiber is gonna move along to the next step. The paper screens help to pull paper out. So again, it's sort of these really fast spinning stations that help to make sure that paper gets pulled out based on its shape and its weight. These polishing screens help to pull off any last little bits of paper. Again, it's these little spinning discs. Anything that's flat gets pulled up to the top. Anything that's 3D falls back. They just got a new piece of equipment in here in December. I want to say it got installed. But one of the things they've really struggled with in terms of paper and cardboard is that the cardboard they used to get was huge because it was furniture boxes and other really large cardboard boxes that were for shipping things, like really large items. But because of places like Amazon and, you know, like anybody who's shipping anything to you, they've come across all these small cardboard boxes now that their machines had a really hard time sorting out. So this optical sorter, which basically shoots a light and can kind of tell what material is coming through, helps them to sort out those smaller pieces of cardboard from other types of materials and their fiber. So they're actually recovering a lot more of that material. And because they're getting more cardboard into the right place, they're actually able to sell it for a higher price. So it's a really awesome thing. Just went in December, but they're pretty excited about it. This is their container line, which where all the containers go. They have a steel magnet that pulls out all those like vegetable cans. They have what's called an eddy current, which is pretty cool. So it's these spinning magnets. If you've ever played with aluminum and magnets, they don't stick to each other. But if you spin magnets really quickly, they can actually sort of be repulsed. So if you think about, if you've ever put the same side of a magnet together and you feel that force pushing, that's what an eddy current is sort of like on a really massive scale. So they can actually use this force, this eddy current in between, and shoot the aluminum cans really quickly and separate them out. So it's using magnetic forces, but not sucking them up. And in the video, it'll be a little bit easier to see. They have another optical sorter. So it's a light that shines through all the different types of plastic. If it shines through and the computer decides that it's #1 plastic, it uses a couple hundred air jets and it shoots that plastic over a wall and everything falls down. Everything else falls through. So we'll see that in the video, but it's a pretty cool machine. They have one for #2 plastic too. The light shoots at the bottle. The computer says, this is #2 plastic, and an air jet shoots that item over the wall and everything else sort of falls through. So now we have out our paper, our cardboard, our glass, our #1 and 2 plastic, our metals. So all that's left is sort of our other plastics and these aseptic containers, and they have another optical sorter that sort of sorts all those out into different categories so they can be recycled. So that's sort of the last step. Everything goes into these bunkers so it can be compacted and shipped off to people who want to buy it. And I want to get a chance to get to our video. So I am going to switch. So it should be on the screen now. It should look like giant piles of trash. So what I'll do is I'll go through this video, and this is like a 1.5 minute video. There's no sound on it, so I'll just kind of tell you what's going on. But this is what it looks like inside this facility in Hazelwood. So these are the piles of recycling as they come in. So this is that tipping floor. This is that end of the drum feeder. So everything's coming out evenly. It's about to go to the pre-sort station. And you can see there's already stuff that we don't want there. So this is that pre-sort station where they're going to pull off everything that's obviously not recyclable. So you can see them pulling off those really big black plastic bags. These are those spinning discs that are sorting out that cardboard. And so you can see the cardboard kind of floats over the top and the containers are fall back. This equipment is why we really do not want plastic bags. The MRF shuts down 1 to 2 hours a day, every day, to cut plastic bags out of the machinery. And if they simply weren't there, they would not have to shut down for that reason. So they have to send somebody in there to cut everything out. They have to get on like a harness and everything. So please do not put your plastic bags into single stream recycling, because this is kind of what happens to all of them. So our cardboard's kind of separate out, and so is our glass. You can see the paper is kind of moving along into those other spinning discs that help to sort out the paper. So you can see the paper is kind of getting pulled up, and all those other big items are getting tossed back. We now have our container line, which has all of our containers on it. That steel magnet is going to come through and pick up all of those cans. And then we're going to get to our eddy current. So watch, because it happens quickly, but you're going to see all the aluminum cans shooting really quickly. So that's what the eddy current does, is it basically uses magnetic forces to shoot those aluminum cans really fast. And then coming up is our optical sorter for plastic. So you'll see those plastic pieces getting shot over a wall because the computer's figuring out really quickly what kind of plastic it is and where it should go. It's a really cool machine, works very quickly. all the stuff eventually goes into bunkers and sort of gets packaged down so it can be sent off to somebody who would want to buy that material. Right now, aluminum's kind of the most valuable thing. Glass right now is probably the least valuable just because it's really heavy and a little bit harder to transport. So I see we have some questions. How is shredded paper handled? So that's a good question. What we've been told from the MRF is sort of the best thing to do with shredded paper is if you do have one of those like paper bags from the grocery store, to just toss your shredded paper in there, sort of roll the top down a couple times, and then it'll get to the right place. It's not the end of the world if you put shredded paper into your single stream recycling bin. It might confetti out a little bit once it gets to the MRF, but it's not the end of the world. But if you can put it into that paper bag, that's a great thing to do with it. Yes, eddy currents are awesome, John. Thanks for suggesting that. Googling videos about them is really cool. Oh, clarifying about the plastic pots. Yes, black plastic is one of like the ones that I'm trying to explain as the best I said. Yes, the black plastic cannot be recycled because, and I'm gonna say this and you're gonna be like, is that really the reason that it can't be recycled? But the belt that everything is moving on is black. So the optical sorter is basically told to ignore everything that it sees that's black, because if it responded to everything it read as black, it would never be able to process anything because the belt is black. So when it scans down and it sees black plastic, it just doesn't register it because it's the same color as the belt. So, you know, black plastic is probably one of those that you end up having to put into the trash just because it's not going to get sorted out at the MRF correctly. Also with like the plastic pots, that's the other reason. And the garden, I know we were talking about earlier, is not doing plastic pot recycling before. And that has more to do with the person that's actually collecting it. So the group that was actually collecting it and recycling it from us before doesn't want to collect from us right now for a variety of reasons. But one of them being that they're just not making a lot of money recycling that plastic. So we have nowhere to go with it. So we're just not a collection site for them right now. It's not that the garden doesn't want to recycle the plastic pots. It's just that the company that we were recycling through doesn't want us to send them to them. So we just don't have a place to go with them right now. So that's kind of the deal with the plastic pots. Any other questions about recycling? If anyone wants to pop them in the group chat.
Maggie, there was a question earlier from Haley, who was asking about a resource to find a recycling center near her, since where she lives does not have curbside recycling.
Okay, awesome. So one of the places you're gonna want to go, and I'll type it in here, if you just like Google STL City Recycles, I know it says STL City, but it basically has a searchable database on there where you can find anything in sort of the greater St. Louis area about where you can recycle different items. So basically you can type in any item into that database. It gives you the information about which 6 you can recycle, but you can type any item into the database, give your zip code, and it will tell you where the closest place is to actually recycle those items. So it's a pretty cool place to be able to do that. Green pots, I don't think the recycling centers really want any of those gardening pots, which is why we had that special collection for them, but that's something I can check on. And then what happens to white plastic garbage bags? If they make it to the material recovery facility, they get pulled off the line and sent to the landfill. We're actually doing better. So when I first started in this job, maybe about 18 months ago, the MRF was sending about 22.5% of what they got at the MRF to the landfill, which meant that close to a quarter of what they were receiving was not something that could be recycled. They were just receiving a whole bunch of trash. It's down closer to 19% now. I know 3.5% doesn't sound magical, but it's a really big difference to them. So it is getting better. People are sort of figuring things out, but those white plastic garbage bags are pretty much just gonna go to the landfill if they end up there. Any other questions? Okay, if any others come up, I'll come back to them. The last thing I wanted to cover is commercial composting. So at the garden, we have garden composting, which are those really big piles that do all of our garden waste, but none of our food waste goes there. All of our food waste goes through St. Louis composting. The collection service for that is called Total Organics. And then the side that actually sells the compost is called St. Louis Composting. They're the same place, same service, just two names for different sides of the business. So they can compost a lot of different things. They can compost any kind of food waste, any certified compostable serviceware like we use at the garden. So any of those like plastics that are made out of corn at the garden that we have, any of those cups that are marked as being compostable, all that stuff can go to this facility when it can't normally go into your normal compost bin. And that's partly because they have these really huge rows where they can compost things. So this is their facility over in Belleville, Illinois. They do have facilities all over the place, but this is their largest one. So you can kind of see here, again, this is like a bulldozer or a truck, I want to say, next to one of their compost piles. So they're these huge, they're 6 or 7 feet tall compost piles. They have a turner that will actually go through them that will help to turn the piles over. They get a lot of material in there, so they get very, very hot, which is why they can break down all of those sort of compostable plastics when you can't normally do that in your own compost pile at home. So, and they will actually get yard waste. So if you live in a municipality around St. Louis, your yard waste may actually go to St. Louis Composting because they have contracts to get yard waste, and then they have contracts to get food waste from places like the garden and a lot of other restaurants. So what they do is they take some of the stuff they get from the yard waste, some of the stuff they get from the food waste, and they can put those sort of in the same pile so they have the right balance of browns and greens to make sure that everything's getting composted correctly. But they take all that stuff, turn it, and make sure that it's composting well, that it's hot enough. They break it down, and then they'll actually resell it as compost. So at the garden, we actually have a special Missouri Botanical Garden composting mix that we get to use at the Missouri Botanical Garden from St. Louis Composting. So we sort of have a relationship where our food waste from the garden and our events goes to St. Louis Composting. They turn it into compost, and it gets to come back to the garden. So it's this really sort of cool circular system that we have going on with St. Louis Composting. So we're really happy to have that. So that's kind of how that composting facility works. Right now in St. Louis, we only have like sort of this really large composting service at a business level. They don't contract with residents or anything like that. They did do a pilot program up in Maryland Heights, but there's no looking to expand that program at this point. Maybe at some point in the future, but it's not something that they're doing right now. So any sort of special collections, most people know about grocery store plastic bag collections. So if you get any plastic, you can take any sort of thin, stretchable plastic, you can take that there. If you have household hazardous waste, both St. Louis County and St. Louis City, and probably all the counties surrounding St. Louis have facilities where you can drop off your household hazardous waste, things like oil, certain types of paints, certain types of chemicals, so they don't go to the landfill. Plenty of electronic collection events that you can also use as well that are reputable, where you can send your stuff. And then for that drop off at the store, any of these items can be accepted there. So you can send your bread bags, your dry cleaning bags, those air pillows in those shipping containers, Ziploc bags if they're clean enough. So if you put your peanut butter and jelly in there and everything kind of leached out, please don't put that bag in, but anything clean can go in there. Your produce bags, newspaper bags, your case wrap, any of that can go into that bin at the store. So quite a wide variety of things you can put in there. And most of it goes to a company, at least the ones from Schnucks go to a company called Trex, which makes it into that, what is it, that like fake looking wood board that you can actually make decks out of, park benches, things like that. So it's sort of that composite material that you can use for decking and park benches. So it's pretty cool if they're able to reuse it. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and come back to me. Anyone else have any questions? Bird seed bags number 4. I would have to check to see if those go into that category at the bin. For now, and kind of our rule of thumb, when in doubt, throw it out. If you're not sure, put it in the landfill or check with one of us. But the biggest thing that we don't want in recycling is something called wish cycling, where we all really wish that it was recyclable and we want to do the right thing. So we want to put it in the blue bin, but it just can't go there. So we want to keep that out. And yes, Glenda, thank you for mentioning that some grocery stores and some stores that normally collect plastic bags aren't doing it right now. Let your bag of bags get bigger. Maybe put it in your basement or a closet. Sit on it so you put all the air out of it and you can put more in, but you can save it up because they should be taking them at some point in the future again. Briefly speak to textile recyclers like remains. Yeah, so if you have any clothing items that can be recycled, a lot of times if you have really nice clothes, you can donate them somewhere like Goodwill or places like that. You can actually take all of your clothes to Remains. So Remains is on Morgan Ford, a couple blocks south, maybe more than a couple, but south of Tower Grove Park. And they have one of those little like yellow huts outside where you can drop your stuff at any point in time. But you can put clothing in there, any sort of grade of clothing. So if you have really gross clothes that you've cleaned, but they're stained and you can't give them away anymore, you can give them to Remains for them to recycle. They do a lot of different things with it. They really like it if you give them nice items sometimes, because those are the items that they can sell and actually keep their business open with. But you can put your other grubby stuff in there as well. But they do a really nice job of sort of sorting all that material out. But Remains is a local business. They're only here in St. Louis, so it's kind of nice if you can throw your clothes their way to help. Yes, good point, John, that upcycling is a really big thing too. And I can also say that like recycling is great and composting is great. The first step is really reducing the waste that you're using and reusing things as much as possible first. Yes, US again for textiles is good as well. Just the people at Remains always like me to throw in that they're all over the country and Remains is right here in St. Louis. So if you want to support local textile recycling, Remains is the place to go. So let me see. What can be done with plastic straws? I guess you could try and craft with them, but the only place for them right now is the trash. They're not going to get picked up at the MRF because they're just too small. So I think I got to all of them. Anyone else have any other questions about any of the stuff we talked about today with waste, recycling, compost? Okay, well, if you do have questions later on, Andrea knows where to find me. If you don't know my email address already, I'm sure Andrea can also send it out if you have any direct questions, or that Green Resource Answer Service is also a great place to go as well. I know Andrea already sent out that Republic MRF tour that they did for Earth Day, but if you get like a spare half hour, it's really great. Brent is awesome. I could listen to him talk about recycling all day. And then St. Louis Composting also did a series. They weren't at their facility doing a tour, but Rachel Greathouse from there was talking about their process with composting. So both of those are pretty interesting.